Today, it's our great pleasure to welcome Professor Kelly Martin from Colorado State University. She's a well-known marketing expert on, for example, the marketing ethics firm strategy interface, and particularly focuses on the topic, on several topics, on political marketing strategy, firm approaches to creating well-being, but in particular also on the topic of data privacy. Due to your background and your interest also in these political aspects and consumer well-being aspects, you're also currently the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing. And yeah, you are particularly well known for your work on consumer reactions to their vulnerability towards privacy breaches, which has been published in the Journal of Marketing. In your talk, you will now address the critical tensions that exists between customers, firms, and regulatory interests, which pose unique challenges for understanding and protecting consumer privacy. And this is, of course, very relevant, particularly in a platform ecosystem context where we have very different interests, a lot of tensions that need to be addressed and need to be considered. And yeah, you really focus in your talk now on those digital platform ecosystems. The topic is protecting customer privacy is good for firms, research insights and implications for digital platform ecosystems. Thank you, Kelly, for being here. It's very early in Colorado right now. It's great that you made it. The stage is yours.
All right, seeing everything just fine then? Okay, wonderful. Well, it's just wonderful to be here, and yes, a little early, but what a great way to begin the day and talk about a topic that is, of course, very near and dear to my interests, and as Jan mentioned, a topic that certainly fits well under the broader heading of digital platform ecosystems. And I'm excited about the initiatives happening at the University of Passau, and hopefully there will be some insights from the talk today that resonate with the great work that your team is doing. So to begin, I'll just give you a little overview of my talk for today. Jan already provided a very kind introduction, so I'll kind of breeze past that part, but provide a few definitions that will help sort of work through the topics that I'll be discussing today. And then I'd like to share 3 broad research insights from my work over the years that I think kind of do a nice job of coalescing some implications for digital platform ecosystems. And so I'll try to spend quite a bit of time talking about that and then some concluding thoughts.
Right. We cannot see the slides yet.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. This, by the way, gives me the opportunity to say something which I forgot, which is that the talk will be recorded. So everybody who has a question needs to be aware that when asking that question during the talk, also the questions will be recorded. Afterwards, we have a Q&A session, which will not be recorded. Yeah, so it's not to encourage disencourage any questions during the talk, but you still just need to be aware that it's being recorded.
Are we fine now? Do you see my slides now? Okay, yeah, very good.
Perfect.
Okay, so I've now gone through the agenda here, as I just mentioned. So like I said, Jan provided a nice introduction. I do work at the Marketing Strategy Ethics Interface, and I've been working on privacy topics for almost a decade. And it really was kind of a funny way that this all began. I was having coffee with my friend Rob Palmatier, and we were talking about privacy topics, and he said, I think this will become a big deal in the next couple of years. And sure enough, it has become a pretty big deal. And so we have worked on some things together. I've worked on privacy topics with a lot of different co-authors, which ultimately culminated in this book. So it's been kind of fun to see sort of all of the different angles that my work has touched, and hopefully will provide some insights today. Also, I'm currently the co-director of our Center for Marketing and Social Impact here at CSU. which is kind of a neat way that our university also brings together themes that touch on the marketing society interface and helps make those more of a dedicated focus of our research efforts here at CSU in the marketing department. So some definitions, it's actually kind of funny to start a privacy talk with definitions because privacy is a really difficult concept to define. And so this is sort of a loaded question, but I thought, let's just overview some of the ways the field has discussed this. And so the first kind of broad family of privacy definitions involves access and control. And I have my little graphic here with a fence to sort of describe that these definitions all talk about boundaries in some way. So privacy can be control over access to yourself or your family. Privacy can be control over your broader environment. The second definition comes from environmental psychology literature. The third definition here is the one that we often will use when we talk about customer data privacy because it involves the transfer and protection of information. And so this third definition where we talk about how the individual has the control over the ability to share that information or not and determines who has access, this Weston definition you'll see used a lot in the literature. Some of my work, though, has thought about privacy in kind of through a different lens where we talk about it as vulnerability. And I think this is sort of interesting because it comes from social psychology, and the social psychologist Schwartz talked about privacy as actually this kind of fundamental component of the human psyche, that if people who are involved in social interactions aren't somehow complemented with some solitude and the chance to retreat away from being with people all of the time, that it's actually bad for their personal well-being. And he talks about this balance between social interaction and withdrawal as being this necessary component for personal harmony. And so I find this definition pretty fascinating because in digital environments, that ability to retreat is increasingly fleeting. It's harder and harder for people to get away from that digital environment where they're either constantly interacting or perhaps their data is constantly being siphoned. So it's kind of an interesting space to look through. And actually, when the Journal of Marketing article that Jan mentioned earlier, we talk about this in sort of a hierarchy. And I'll use some of this thinking today where customer vulnerability with regard to data privacy can sort of happen in this escalating fashion, where this bottom blue layer really just talks about customers feeling vulnerable because a company has access to their information. Now, as you move up, I'm going to skip past the green one for now, but talk about the yellow one. This data breach vulnerability occurs when a company suffers a data breach. So clearly, a customer feels vulnerable if a company that they use, that they know has their information, is breached and their information is out there. And then this red, the top of the triangle here, talks about the fact that data can become misused, identity theft can happen, accounts can be opened fraudulently in a consumer's name. This is sort of the top peak here. Now, what's interesting is we don't see a ton of difference in how vulnerable consumers report to feel in that blue and red tier, because they feel like once their information's out there, they really lack a lot of control over that. Now, I wanted to point out this green layer here, this spillover vulnerability, because it's a little bit unique. And the idea of spillover vulnerability is that a company can suffer a data breach. And when a customer learns about that company, if they don't use that company, but they use a close rival, they will feel vulnerable. And a good example of that would be in the States here several years ago, a big home improvement, do-it-yourself kind of hardware store, the Home Depot, suffered a very big data breach. Now, customers that didn't use the Home Depot, but used their competitor Lowe's, actually felt strong vulnerability because they learned about that competitor data breach. So this is spillover vulnerability. And the reason I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that especially is that there is an incredible opportunity for spillover vulnerability in a digital platform ecosystem, because any firm within that ecosystem that may suffer a breach or a privacy failure has implications for spillover effects across the entire ecosystem. So this will be something that I come back to. Now, getting into the research themes that I mentioned. So we've got these foundations, these definitional orientations. The first research insight that I wanted to share is the notion that customers do care about their privacy. They just don't necessarily understand how to protect it very well. And believe it or not, this is a fairly controversial assertion. It's controversial to say that customers care because there's a whole school of thought that says they don't and that they behave counterintuitive to that. What we have found in our work is that, as I mentioned before, customers feel very vulnerable, even if a company just has access to their information. And some of the outcomes we found from that is that they reported they would would decrease their purchase intent. They'd increase their opportunity to switch if they had an opportunity to switch to a close competitor. They were more likely to spread negative word of mouth. And we even saw these effects play out in financial performance data for firms. So we saw this with stock price loss. We saw this with market value decline. So this is manifest in both secondary data with the firm and customer reports. Okay, so vulnerability can have these negative effects. Customers also increasingly report that when they interact with different types of digital interfaces, they work to try to manage their privacy and their settings accordingly. And we've even seen that customers increasingly report that they're willing to pay to protect their privacy. So they're willing to pay additional fees if they can protect particularly certain classes of sensitive information like their health data, financial data. Now, the reason this is controversial is that there's this whole realm of study called the privacy paradox, where the notion is that customers may say they care about their privacy, but then they behave in a way that's counterintuitive to that. They share a lot of information on social media. They willingly disclose information to whomever they interact with. But what we found in our work, some of the work that I have with Aaron Bruff, is that customers, it's not so much about that they just do this, they don't really know what they're doing. That there's these two kind of key components we found: the motivation to protect their information and the knowledge to be able to do so. Customers have a lot of motivation around protecting their personal information, but they don't necessarily understand how to do so. Some of the evidence around this comes from some of the big research organizations in the States, like Pew Research, for example, that has done these kind of privacy quizzes with the American public, and people are terrible on these. They don't really understand how to even identify a secure website to complete a transaction. They don't understand what happens when they divulge their information. So they're really kind of bad at knowing how to protect their information in a strong way. So it's not necessarily that there's this privacy paradox, but what we do see is this, what we call personalization paradox. And for marketing, this is pretty bad because customers like interacting with firms that can customize experiences for them, create personal products, personal services. But because they're afraid of disclosing information, they actually make it harder for companies to do this for them. And so you create a paradox in that way, where even though they like these offerings, they aren't willing to interact with the firm in the way that makes them possible. So this is kind of a big problem. Now, here we see this problem that plays out even when customers kind of understand the interface that they're working in. But of course, with new technologies, we see that customers their data is being taken in multiple ways that they may not actually even understand. So think, for example, of all of the different database touch points in your vehicle that are collecting information about your driving behavior, the speed you travel, how well you stay in the lines, right? Your vehicles are constantly collecting massive amounts of data about you, even your voice and text, right? Smart airplanes are now collecting information about maybe how long you sleep when you're on a business trip. Did you order that second glass of wine, right? All of this information can be collected now in this format. All of the apps that we now use in hopes of enhancing our well-being, right? Tracking our health information, using fitness trackers. All of that is data that's just being completely taken with very little regulation, particularly here in the States, where we have health protections for information, but they only apply to sort of traditional healthcare providers, such as hospitals and medical clinics. So all of this health information that's gathered in this way is just completely fair game. This is one of my favorites, right? People provide such sensitive information through these DNA trackers, right? Oh, let's learn about my ancestry. And in the meantime, their entire genetic sequence becomes in the public domain. And by the way, I'm guilty of a lot of these. So I'm not here judging to say, oh, our consumers so silly, right? Facial tracking, right? This is another way that our images are taken, that governments, that other entities can recognize exactly who we are. And here's another example of where we as consumers maybe even do this willingly. If you recall, a couple of years ago, Google provided this app called their Arts and Culture app. And so you upload an image of your face, and what Google would do for you is scan all of the big famous art museums in the world and match a work of art to your face, right? So of course, like, I'm sucked in, but thankfully I have my my personal doppelganger here, right? I mean, we're almost indistinguishable. But here, interest of fun and a couple of laughs, my image now is in the hands of Google to do whatever they want, right? Now, this becomes increasingly problematic when you think about digital platform ecosystems where customers not only have these multiple ways that they interface with their everyday interactions that their data is being collected, but it's also being collected all the way along in this process. And so if you look holistically, you can see the many ways that consumers just really are ill-equipped to be able to sufficiently guard their personal information. So here's oftentimes where the regulators will step in and say, okay, consumers need some help. We need to weigh some protections. And so this brings me to my second research insight, and that's that currently in my work, we're seeing some cautious optimism around the way that global regulations are working to protect consumer privacy and actually having some positive effects for firms as well. The Journal of Retailing special issue that Jan mentioned earlier, in which he also has a very good article, the work that we had done in that particular article with my research team, we did a big global research endeavor where we collected survey data from customers in various parts of the world. We interviewed executives and conducted a couple of case studies. And some of the themes that emerged, looked at how focal data is to retail interactions. So this was in a retail setting, but we also found this profound effect of regulation. So I'll just share a few quick takeaways here. This was, just asking consumers in this global study about the confidence that they feel from the regulations in their countries. Overall, customers felt like if they could opt out to sharing their information that they would, but that overall companies have done a pretty good job of making the case that it's fair for consumers to share information, that it's fair for companies to have that information. And when you looked at the extent to which consumers in these various countries felt like their information was being protected and they were less worried, you can see that the German consumers in the sample were the lowest in terms of worry. And we attributed a lot of that, of course, to the GDPR, right? This was data from the GDPR about a year out that suggested that, in France, Germany, at the time, UK being part of this, right, reported some, strong reactions to the extent to which they felt like their information was being protected, where they were seeing a positive impact of the GDPR. And actually saw some ripple effects over to the US here, because of course, many of the companies that do business here in the States also do so in Europe. And so even American consumers were seeing this positive spillover from the GDPR. Now, what's interesting though, is if you think about global regulations, even within Europe, and I apologize that I can't zoom in on Europe a little bit more, but even within Europe, where you have kind of this broad regulatory system that looks at data privacy, you still see quite a bit of variation within. Of course, you see this global variation elsewhere. And the reason being for this particular index, it not only looks at data privacy regulation through a country or broader level regulation like a GDPR, but they look at the extent to which the government implements surveillance, whether identity cards and biometrics are being used, overall leadership approach to this. So there are multiple metrics here that this bestvpn.org uses to create this international privacy index. And so really, I think what you're seeing is that there's still a lot of variation, that a big broad level type of regulation, such as the GDPR, isn't telling us the whole story. And of course, let's throw in one more level of complication here. And this involves the fact that we're living through a global pandemic, right? Now, when you think about the extent to which we've changed some of our practices related to customer data privacy in this environment, it's pretty fascinating. So again, this is a paper with Aaron Bruff where we looked at some of the big changes that have occurred just in the last year, and things like increased surveillance by governments, right? Where, the intent is to protect people's health and to keep people safe. And so things like increased surveillance were occurring. So governments could see if people were following social distance protocols. Some of this surveillance involved thermal scanning. So people in different entities could detect whether people had a high temperature, whether they were at risk of passing a disease. Of course, there were so many new digital records being created, and not just on the health front, but also just because so many customers had to move online when they couldn't go physically into the stores where they normally purchase things. So online grocery shopping exploded, right? Because people needed to access those materials and they couldn't go into the store. And so all of these new digital records were being created. And in some ways, this is pretty fascinating because some of those folks that moved online that had not been online were maybe the least equipped to do so, right? They were online, they weren't online before because they didn't understand. They were kind of worried about it. This is like my parents, right? They had never shopped online for groceries, but they were all of a sudden forced to. Now, were they able to adequately set their privacy protections and controls? That's a really good question, right? Lots of sharing between governments, among different health entities. This was also really interesting when the pandemic first began unfolding, because there was so much work to try to keep people safe that in the process, with some of the contact tracing, for example, that in many countries, people were being exposed, their identities were being exposed once they tested positive in an effort to keep others safe. But you saw some things like, shaming behaviors that were happening, where people were actually posting and further spreading that information to shame someone for contracting COVID-19. And so there were really a lot of just kind of bizarre behaviors that happened with the sharing of personal information in this way. And then, of course, we also saw some pretty famous security weaknesses that were exposed during the time. Think about all the Zoom bombing that was occurring when all of this first began. So really, I think the long-term implications from what's happened with the pandemic on customer data privacy are still unfolding. You might say that this will all create a lot of great security, that some of the weaknesses that we saw and the fact that we saw so many people moving online that hadn't been will ultimately be good for security and privacy. There also may be worries because many of the regulatory exemptions, so broad global regulations, including the GDPR, for example, have clauses where certain protections can be lifted in times of catastrophic whatever, right? So a pandemic certainly qualifies for that type of an exemption. Some of these exemptions include research, and the medical field has certainly asked for some of these exemptions to study the ways the virus has mutated and moved across the world. But some of the exemptions have certainly not been so benign. Now, if we look at this and we think about, okay, so regulation can't be the complete answer because there are loopholes and there are ways that this certainly might break down. This puts some of the responsibility for protecting customer data privacy back on the firm. And when we think about this, and if you look at the research that I've done, what we find by and large is that protecting customer data privacy, even though it certainly involves some expense and some time and some ramping up in terms of firm knowledge, it's by and large good for the firm. Now, I began my talk discussing some of those definitions and had mentioned that tier of customer vulnerability. And I also talked about the negative outcomes that you see on the right of the slide here that can occur from customers experiencing vulnerability. But also in our work, we've identified these two levers, transparency and control, that are incredibly powerful in interrupting that link between customer vulnerability and the negative outcomes. Now, we started out this project, the very first project in 2017, with literally thousands of customer surveys and experiments and different ways that we wanted to understand what was the missing link between vulnerability and these outcomes. And over again, transparency and control kept surfacing and bubbling to the top. And we looked at things like fairness, ethicality, trust, and trust does play a role, but the two big levers here are transparency and control. And these are completely within the firm's control when you think about the extent to which they can offer transparency, which is simply telling customers what they will do with their personal information, and control, which is simply giving customers some say in how that information is used, letting them opt out to certain uses, letting them determine with whom their data is shared. These are fairly straightforward levers that the company has at their disposal. So let me talk through some additional findings. This was a project where, kind of related to that previous one, we had gone through and coded all of the Fortune 500 companies' privacy policies for various dimensions. Now, just a caveat right away, we don't think people actually read privacy policies. We know that no one does. But what we did discover, number one, is that a privacy policy is legally enforceable. So if a company behaves in a way that contradicts its privacy policy, it can be sanctioned for that. Number two is when we went through and coded these, we wanted to see if there was correspondence between the way the company says that they will act with privacy and the way customers think that they do. And the correspondence between the coding on the privacy policies and customer instruments that looked at this was about 90%. So customers already kind of knew what companies did in that regard. that matched with what was coded in the privacy policy. So we had quite a bit of evidence that suggested this was a good proxy for the extent to which the firm actually behaves. So we coded all of these, and we looked at the extent to which companies had transparency and control. Then we looked to see, out of those 500 companies over the years, who had suffered data breaches. And what we found was that those companies that had suffered data breaches that had high levels of transparency and control suffered far less losses than did the companies that had low levels of those two dimensions. So let me just give you an example. One of the companies in our data set was Citigroup. And Citigroup had what was at the time considered a massive data breach. I kind of laugh at that now because they had a 360,000 record problem in 2011. Now that's considered pretty small compared to some of the data breaches we've learned about. But that data breach of 360,000 records, at the time, Citibank had very low transparency and control in their privacy practices. They suffered a stock loss around that window of 1.3 billion. Now, when you compare Citigroup using paired matching and some of these other kind of matching techniques with other financial service firms at the time who had high transparency and control, we can estimate that their stock loss would have been about 63 million. Now that's still a huge amount, but when you think that that translates to a $1.2 billion saving, it's pretty substantial. So there was a lot of evidence within the project that found outcomes just like this. And I know that transparency and control are two easy levers. I'll be talking more about those, but companies are also, they have many other ways to manage and measure data privacy responses. They can look at this by talking with their customers and looking at the extent to which customers believe that they practice data privacy in various ways. They can also use secondary data through social media sentiment. They can track the extent to which their company's been trained, implementing a chief privacy officer, for example. So on the firm side, there are increasingly sophisticated and defensible ways to measure the extent to which data privacy has become part of the firm. So what does all this mean for digital platform ecosystems? Well, there obviously are a lot of connections just with the insights that I've shared, but I wanted to begin by thinking through some kind of key foundations to how data privacy relates to digital platform ecosystems. And so one of the big ones, of course, is that for customers to actually co-create that value in the platform ecosystem, they must share their information. It's part of being a part of interacting, right? To get the personalized playlist on Spotify, you have to share the songs you like, right? So there are many ways that customers just really must share information and share their data to be able to receive the types of value that they're seeking when they access the digital platform. On the firm side, the ability for the digital platform to proliferate, to grow, and to be viable also requires data sharing. So it requires the data sharing from the customer initially, but it also requires this multi-directional sharing, which is pretty fascinating. And so this need for data sharing and the way that it proliferates and expands and the way that it flows in multi-directions can create just massive vulnerability, not only for customers, but also for the firm. And so going back to that little hierarchy of customer data privacy vulnerability, each type can really be pinged in the digital platform ecosystem. And additional privacy risks can be created because of the nature of this. And we only need to think back to the very famous Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, where nobody had ever heard of this Cambridge Analytica. This was kind of like, what is this? I've never heard of this. How is this all of a sudden, this entity that has all my information and is using it in this way that I'm not comfortable with? And this happened really to expose what's going on behind the scenes in a digital platform ecosystem, where you've got apps and you've got all of these entities that are using personal information. And when a failure occurs, it can be really a wake-up call. And this is an example that occurred several years ago that people are still talking about. And so I think that when you think about the extent to which digital platform ecosystems use and share data, we will only continue to kind of see these sort of concerns. Going to just some kind of public data around how customers feel about these technology companies, which are just one form of digital platform. By and large, customers across many countries believe that these firms have much too much control over their personal information. And this increases as customers get older. So even, maybe that's a finding you would expect, even those younger groups that we sort of call these digital natives that are supposed to be comfortable with all of this, reported 59% of them in that youngest age group reported that they felt like these technology companies had much too much control over their personal information. So when you think through the type of customer vulnerability that is created, well, that's occurring in these digital platform ecosystems, and here's, a little snippet of one part of Amazon's ecosystem, right? You can think about the different types of risks that are created. There are risks to customer information, or the ability for consumers to control the way that their information and their personal data is shared. There's communication risk. So customer communicates with the firm, or they communicate with another customer, and that may be intercepted. That's communication risk. And then, of course, physical risk to the consumer, his or herself. So let's look at some of this. And this comes from an ongoing project that I'm working on with some colleagues in Australia, thinking through the extent to which customers, regulators, and firms interact in digital platform ecosystem spaces and how these risks may play out. And I'd just like to mention a few of these. I know there's a lot of information going on here, but it gives you a little bit of a feel for all of the ways that customer data is being used and some of the examples and the ways it can be misused. When we think about information risks, first of all, in digital platform spaces, this can be information that's shared on social media. This can be things like customers' biometric data. It can be information that's solicited from an IoT system in a consumer's home, various web tracking information, and some interesting risks that you've seen and that you know have happened are ways that these companies have been able to study and exploit consumer mood and emotion. So when customers have to respond to this, they ultimately can say, I'm not going to share information, right? In any of these examples, they can simply shut down and stop using the service, which of course is undesirable for both the customer and the firm. They can also begin to share false information. And we actually see that a lot in the academic literature, where customers have these different fake profiles that they use to interact in digital spaces. And again, that doesn't really help them. It doesn't really help the firm. On the regulator side, I have a little asterisk here, because really regulators have the power to shut down really any of these. And so they can choose to do that, or they can do things like, more nuanced approaches where they require companies to share more transparent practices, give customers more control, allow customers to correct any discrepancies to their personal information, or require different forms of consent. And you see those are levers that regulators use a lot. And on the firm side, firms can ultimately use these transparency and control levers as well, anonymize and de-identify, and of course use data minimization, which is a best practice that we advocate for in a lot of my work. On the communication risk side, a lot of this can occur through web tracking, cloud technologies, digital assistants, and robotics. I think this is a pretty fascinating space, because consumers are now talking with their digital assistants just like another family member, right? It's become so handy. I know the way that my son talks with Siri, I think that she's in the home, right? She's so helpful to him. I don't use those types of technologies to nearly the extent that he does, right? But he relies on her for everything. Now, all of that information, all of that text is being taken, right? Whether you are allowing it to or not. And so that can also be analyzed and used in ways that could present risks to consumers. Again, consumer response can be exit and switching, which again is not helpful to anyone. Regulators can require greater transparency, which is also a little bit of a risk, right? When you think about if customers know that all of that text information they're providing is out there, how does that change their interactions? And then on the firm side, we think about privacy design, some of this more informed consent, something that I find pretty fascinating. And I've just started to look at this more. I know that companies have begun to start doing what's called zero-party data collection. And so instead of trying to siphon customer information without consent, or going through third parties that already have data, like some of these big data profiling companies, that companies are doing zero-party data initiatives where they actually just seek out with the customer, hey, can we have a conversation with you? Can we actually ask you some of these things? So we're not using maybe some of these less scrupulous third-party data providers, that we're actually working with you. So you tell us what you're comfortable with sharing, and we'll only ask you that. And it's actually producing some fairly rich data for companies. I think this may be some of the future in terms of customer-firm interactions, but it can be a good way for firms to respond for communication risks, but really it could work for any of these. And then in the last category here with regard to individual risks, here we think about types of technologies that can actually threaten physical privacy of a consumer. When you think about geospatial location devices and some of these tracking tools, even IoT, we have the ability to know exactly where a consumer is at any given time. Now, if you think about you're a Starbucks and you want to offer a consumer who's walking by your shop a discount to come in, that sounds really great. But if you're Starbucks and you know that your customer is walking by a competitor and you send them a coupon so they come instead to your shop, how does that work ethically speaking? We think about just customers' increased fear and mental health risks about feeling tracked, about feeling watched. And those, of course, can create lots of problems. On the regulator side, again, consent and warnings. And this is one place where it seems to me like regulators could step in and do a little bit more, simply because the risk to physical location just implies, quite a few negative potential outcomes for consumers. And on the firm side, again, more warnings, more tracking, and more consent and anonymization being provided to consumers also could be helpful. So I wanted to, as we begin to wind down here, share just some really exploratory data-based insights. And I thought this would be kind of fun. What I did to prepare for the talk was actually, I went back to that data that we collected for that Journal of Retailing study where we'd surveyed consumers globally. And we had done so, for a retail lens, but I thought, why don't I go back through this and look at some implications for some of the digital platform ecosystems firm in the sample. So this is just kind of high level takeaways, but I wanted to look at sort of some of the customer outcomes about data and information sharing in that sample, and some of the ways that maybe customer data vulnerability was being manifest, and looking at that through a lens of both the broader set of companies in the sample, but also contrasting that with data platform ecosystem firms. So the first just little slice of information here. Now, by the way, I did this just using a very simple like hierarchical linear modeling technique where you have consumers nested within companies that they responded about, nested within countries. And the first analysis here was looking at some customer outcomes. So I had already talked about this like willingness to opt out, future sales, likelihood of switching. So those customer outcomes. And I looked at them for digital platform companies versus the others in our sample. And then also examined two different types of customer value that customers can potentially receive from sharing their information. And these two big categories would be customer experience value. And I talked about this a little bit with the personalization paradox. And this is the value that customers believe they receive because they share their information that gives them a better experience, a better product, a better service, a better overall interaction with the firm. And then there's customer economic value, which simply means the company offers the customer a discount for providing that information. Okay, so what we see is that across this sample, that by and large, if companies are providing customers experience value, they're more willing to share their information. They're likely to devote a greater share of their wallet to that company. They're more likely to purchase from them in the future, and they're less likely to switch. So providing this customer experience value is incredibly important, much more so than any kind of financial exchange. And actually, you only see that in the opt-in willingness, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because usually a company will ask for that initial information and provide you a discount for doing so. And so when you opt in initially, you may say, okay, I would like a discount for that. But then these other kind of more long-term relational outcomes, really, we don't see much effect from this economic value. So the exchange really lies in the value that's being provided on the experience side. Note too that we didn't see any significant differences here across digital platform firms, except when it came to future sales. And so customers reported that they were going to devote much more sales in a particular category to these digital platform firms, which is kind of interesting when you think about the fact that this implies this long-term sort of future interaction, which is good for those firms, but also means that they really need to think about the ways that they're protecting customers' privacy. In the second analysis, I looked at vulnerability types of outcomes. So 3 different outcomes that, well, vulnerability that we've used in our work, but 2 of these other dimensions have been used in lots of different data privacy studies where the worry about a data breach was queried, as was customers felt privacy concerns. And so when we look at this across consumers, we ask them, first of all, how well they felt like their country's regulatory environment protected their information. They reported that they felt less data breach worry in this particular analysis. When we coded for the digital platform types of firms, we see that customers were actually reporting less felt vulnerability using those companies and less worry about a data breach, which was pretty interesting and pretty good for those firms when you think about the implications, and no significant effect on privacy concerns. What we also saw was that data privacy index, that country level index that I showed you earlier with the world map, that had a strong and significant effect on diminishing these fears. So again, I had mentioned that we saw some preliminary evidence that some of this global regulation is working, and we see evidence in that regard here as well. So what does all this mean? Well, let's look at just a couple of last levers that I began with, thinking through transparency and control and some of these other dimensions that customers benefit from and that firms have at their disposal, at their ability to tweak these levers. When looking at this data, when I looked at transparency between digital platform firms and all of the other firms in the sample, there was no significant difference whatsoever. So customers across the board felt like they were providing about the same amount of transparency in their practices. There was slightly diminished trust, though, between the digital platform firms and the firms that were coded with, that were some other type of firm, which is kind of interesting when you think of the positive effects that we also saw in that particular analysis earlier. So definitely more work would need to be done to investigate these findings. But something else that I thought was fairly interesting was the fact that overall, customers reported significantly less control with digital platform firms and with the other firms. So on the one hand, you saw the graphic where, when asked with the global survey by YouGov, that customers felt like these companies have too much control of their information. And then here, this little chart suggests that they don't feel like they have enough control. So the company has all the control over their information and they don't have as much. So I thought that was kind of a nice juxtaposition to sort of bookend those findings. So what are some takeaways thinking through how a company can manage customer data privacy and how they can do so in a way that protects customers, but it is also good for them. And these tenets for privacy marketing come from some of the work that I've done with Rob and some of the work in the book, but I think that they apply really, really nicely to the digital platform space. Thinking through ways to, number one, avoid customer data vulnerability, whether that's through minimizing data or working with customers more directly through zero-party data interactions, or empowering them more greatly with transparency and control. Balancing data sharing and privacy. There are a lot of studies out there that just show that consumers think that some of the ways they're being tracked and the ways that these companies interact with them feel creepy. And so doing things that strengthen relationships and build trust rather than appearing like you're creepy can go a long way in working with your customers on the firm side. Providing experience value is key, and I talked through some of those findings with you earlier in protecting data. Preempting privacy regulations. We didn't really get into this in the interest of time, but most privacy regulations are very, very lagged, right? I mean, regulations almost always tend to fall far behind technology advancement. And as digital platforms continue to proliferate, and as I mentioned before, the nature of the data sharing, the way that it moves in multi-directional ways and across a network, make it much different than just a traditional customer firm exchange. And so for companies to anticipate that the regulation will be lagging is a really important piece of advice to pass on. Recovering from data breaches, again, I just talked very briefly about the data breach element, that thinking through for data platform companies, the extent to which a data breach in any one of their partners in any node on the network could affect them through spillover vulnerability is going to be incredibly important. And then finally, just tracking data privacy, as I talked about earlier. All right, so to sum up, I tried to give you some insights into how all of these different insights that I've learned through my research over the years translate to the digital platform ecosystem environment. And I think it's so important to know that customer data has allowed these to be successful and to flourish, and this is a good thing. But that regulation can't be the entire answer to how these continue to work in a way that benefits both firms and customers. Firms need to think proactively about how they can also minimize customer vulnerability, and that doing so doesn't need to be a barrier to their performance. And some of the insights that I shared show that actually enabling transparency and control for customers can be a strategic advantage, can be a way that companies actually compete on privacy. And we're looking at some of those questions in current research right now. And I think I'm right on time. I just want to thank everyone again for the ability to come share some of my work with your group, and look forward to taking any questions that you all have.